The bank teller printed the statement twice because she thought the machine had glitched. My savings account, the one I'd spent 41 years filling, showed a balance of $63. I remember the way she looked at me. Not with pity, not yet. More like confusion, the kind that wrinkles the space between someone's eyes when the numbers on a screen refuse to make sense. She was young, maybe 25, and she kept tapping her fingernail against the counter while the second printout crawled from the machine. I stood there in my good coat, the camel one with the brass buttons, because I had always believed that how you presented yourself at a bank mattered. 41 years of believing that. 41 years of depositing portions of every paycheck, every tax return, every small windfall that came from tutoring calculus to teenagers who didn't want to learn it. I had walked in that morning to withdraw $1,500 for a new furnace. I walked out with a number that wouldn't cover a week of groceries. The teller asked if I wanted to speak with a manager. I said yes, because what else does a person say when the floor drops out from under them in a fluorescent-lit lobby? The manager was a man named Dennis who smelled like cough drops and spoke to me in the measured tone people use with the very old or the very confused. I was 68, not 90. I was neither old enough nor confused enough to have misplaced $347,000. Dennis pulled up the transaction history. He turned his monitor so I could see it, and the withdrawals scrolled down the screen like a liturgy of theft. 5,000 here, 8,000 there, 12,000 on a Tuesday in March when I had been home reading a novel about the Oregon Trail. The transfers had started 14 months earlier, moving in steady, calculated increments from my savings into a joint checking account I did not recognize. The account number meant nothing to me. The routing number meant nothing. But the joint account modification form, the one Dennis printed and slid across his desk with an apology caught somewhere in his throat, that meant everything, because it bore my name in handwriting that was not mine. I have written my name perhaps 100,000 times in my life. I know its architecture the way I know the layout of my kitchen in the dark. The E in Eleanor has always leaned slightly left, a habit from childhood, from being corrected by a nun who believed penmanship was next to godliness. The signature on that form leaned right. It was close, I'll grant that. Someone had studied me. Someone had practiced the loops and the crossed T and the way I finish Hartfield with a long tail on the D. But they had gotten the lean wrong, and they had gotten the pressure wrong. And I knew, sitting in that office with the cough drop air pressing against my temples, I knew with the kind of certainty that lives in your sternum, not your head, that someone I trusted had done this. Attached to the account modification was a durable power of attorney. It had been filed with the bank 11 months before the first withdrawal, which meant whoever had done this had been patient. They had planned, they had waited. The POA granted broad financial authority over my accounts to an agent whose name was redacted on the copy Dennis could show me. Some policy about internal review, he said, his voice thinning to almost nothing. But the emergency contact line at the bottom of the form was not redacted. It sat there in plain 12-point type, unhidden, unremarkable, the way a knife just sits in a drawer until you reach for it. Dennis asked if I was all right. I told him I needed a moment. He left me alone in his office with the door cracked open and the sound of the lobby carrying in, someone's child laughing, a receipt printer chattering. The ordinary music of a Wednesday morning in a world that had not just split open. I picked up the power of attorney form. I read it again. I read it the way you read a doctor's report when the diagnosis doesn't make sense yet. When your eyes keep traveling the same lines, hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something survivable. They didn't rearrange. The signature at the bottom was close, I'll give it that. Whoever had done it knew the way I looped my capital E, knew I always crossed my T's with a slight upward slant, a habit left over from Palmer method cursive drilled into me in a schoolroom that smelled of chalk dust and radiator heat. But the R in Hartfield was wrong. My R's have always been lazy. They lean, they barely lift off the line. A quirk my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Plimpton, tried and failed to correct. This R stood upright, confident, written by someone who thought they knew my hand better than they did. I set the form on Dennis's desk and pressed my palms flat against my thighs. The fabric of my slacks was cool. I focused on that coolness the way you focus on a railing when the floor tilts. I was not going to cry in a bank. I had cried in hospitals, in church pews, in the kitchen at 2 in the morning after Richard died, standing over a pot of water I'd put on to boil, and then forgotten why. Those were appropriate places for grief. A bank was not. A bank was a place for transactions, and what I needed now was not tears but arithmetic. The withdrawals had started in March. It was November. 8 months of transfers, Dennis had said. Varying amounts, some small enough to look like automated bill payments, others large enough to make my stomach go concave when I saw them on the printout. 38,000 here, 12,000 there. Then a long quiet stretch in summer, as if whoever held the strings had paused to let the account breathe, to let it refill just enough from my pension deposits and social security before drawing it down again. Patient, methodical, the way someone milks an animal, never enough to kill it, just enough to keep taking. I thought about the trip to Costco last week, when my debit card had been declined for a $57 purchase, and I'd assumed it was a bank error. I thought about the property tax notice I'd called the county about, because the online payment bounced and the clerk had spoken to me slowly, carefully, as if I were confused, as if 68 meant fragile. I thought about how I'd checked my balance on the phone app 3 days ago and seen a number that seemed low but not alarming because the screen was small and my eyes aren't what they were, and I had trusted that the architecture of my own life was still standing. Dennis came back with a paper cup of water. I thanked him. I drank it. The water tasted like nothing, the way shock tastes like nothing. The way the air in that office had become a kind of blank white noise, pressing equally on all sides. I asked Dennis for a copy of everything. He printed the statements, the POA form, the transaction log. He put them in a manila envelope and handed it across the desk with both hands, the way you hand someone a folded flag. I tucked it under my arm. I shook his hand. I walked through the lobby past the laughing child and the chattering printer and the Wednesday, ordinary of it all, and I pushed through the glass doors into a parking lot where the November light was thin and honest and had no opinion about what had happened to me. I sat in my car with the engine off. The paper curled in my fist. I smoothed it against the steering wheel and read the emergency contact line one more time. The phone number printed neat as a prayer beneath a signature I had never given. It was James's number, and I knew it by heart. The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday, a bank statement addressed to me but already opened. The seal peeled back with a precision that suggested neither accident nor apology. I stood at the kitchen counter holding it the way you'd hold a dead bird a cat had dragged in, between 2 fingers, at arm's length, trying to decide what kind of trouble it represented. The morning light came through the window above the sink and lit up the adhesive where the flap had been resealed, a faint shimmer of glue that someone had smoothed down with a thumbnail. I knew it was a thumbnail because I could see the crescent-shaped impression. James had broad thumbs. I'd held his hands for 41 years. I knew them better than my own. I told myself it was nothing, a mistake at the post office, a flap that hadn't sealed properly. I told myself all the small lies that keep a marriage stitched together on an ordinary morning, and I set the statement on the counter and poured my coffee and watched a cardinal land on the fence outside. But the envelope sat there the way a stone sits at the bottom of a shoe, impossible to ignore once you've noticed it. By the time James came downstairs, I'd found 2 more, a credit card statement, opened and resealed. A letter from my financial advisor, same treatment, all 3 addressed to me, all 3 already read by someone who wasn't me. I didn't raise my voice. I never had been a woman who raised her voice. I set the 3 envelopes in a row on the breakfast table like evidence, which is what they were, and I asked him plainly. He didn't deny it. That was the part that unsettled me most. A liar would have fumbled, deflected, performed surprise. James sat down across from me with his reading glasses still perched on his forehead, and his expression arranged into something that looked rehearsed, calm, measured, slightly wounded, as if I'd caught him doing something noble and misunderstood it. He left the room and came back with a manila folder. I remember the folder was new, the creases still sharp, a little office supply sticker on the tab. He'd labelled it in his careful block letters. It said Eleanor, Finances. Inside were printouts, my credit card transactions highlighted in yellow, margin notes in his handwriting. A grocery receipt from March where I had apparently bought the same brand of olive oil twice in 1 week. He'd circled it and written * repetitive purchasing, with a question mark that wasn't really a question. There was a withdrawal I'd made in cash to pay the woman who cleaned our gutters, flagged as * unexplained. *A donation I'd made to the public radio station, marked * impulsive. He spoke slowly, the way people speak to children and foreigners and women they've decided are diminishing. He said he was worried. He said he'd noticed patterns. He said he loved me, and I believed that he believed it, which is a different thing entirely from believing it myself. Then he told me he'd already called Sarah. The room didn't spin. Nothing dramatic happened to my body, but something shifted behind my ribs, some structural support that had been bearing weight for decades, and I felt the load redistribute into places that weren't designed for it. He'd called our daughter. He'd told her what? That her mother was slipping, that her mother couldn't be trusted with her own money, that her mother needed watching. He said Sarah was concerned too. He said it gently, like he was delivering a gift. I nodded. I cleared the breakfast dishes. I wiped the counter in slow circles while he watched me from the doorway, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost surgical that I was being observed, catalogued. Every small gesture measured against some invisible threshold he'd already decided I was approaching. That evening, after he'd gone to walk the dog, I sat down at the family computer to check my email. The browser was still open to his account. I should have closed it. I should have respected the boundary the way I'd respected every boundary in 43 years of marriage. But something had shifted in me during those slow circles on the countertop. Something quiet and fundamental, like a bone setting itself after years of being slightly, imperceptibly wrong. I scrolled. The email to Sarah sat in his drafts folder, third from the top, sandwiched between a hardware store receipt and a newsletter about fly fishing he'd never unsubscribed from. The subject line read simply, "Next steps, Mum." Not my name, not Eleanor, just asterisk mum asterisk, as though I'd already been reduced to a role rather than a person, a problem to be managed rather than a woman to be spoken to. He'd written it that morning, time-stamped at 6:14, while I was still asleep, while the coffee was still dripping, while the house was dark and I was dreaming about nothing in particular. He'd been composing my erasure before I'd even opened my eyes. The first paragraph was tender enough to make me sick. He told Sarah he loved me. He told her this wasn't easy for him. He described the bank statement incident as though he'd stumbled upon evidence of a disease. Asterisk, your mother's been making some unusual purchases. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the pattern concerns me. Asterisk, the purchases he meant were a new set of watercolor supplies and a donation to the local library's literacy program. $68 and $150 respectively. Sums so modest they wouldn't have registered as noise in the life we'd built. The life funded largely by my 31 years as a district comptroller. The second paragraph was worse. He catalogued my behavior with the detachment of a field researcher. Asterisk, she repeats herself at dinner. She forgot where she put the car keys last Thursday. She left the stove burner on twice in November. Each observation stripped of its context, that I'd repeated the story about my college roommate because Sarah hadn't been listening the first time, that the car keys had been in his coat pocket where he'd absent-mindedly dropped them, that the burner had been left on low to keep the soup warm while he was late coming home. He'd taken the ordinary texture of a life lived in proximity and refashioned it into a clinical portrait of decline. But it was the third paragraph that did the real damage. He'd asked Sarah to research conservatorship attorneys. He used the word asterisk discreetly. Asterisk, he mentioned a colleague at the firm whose mother-in-law had gone through the process. Asterisk, painless, he said, once the paperwork's in order. Asterisk, he'd already gathered the name of a physician who specialized in cognitive assessments, a man I'd never met and never consented to see. James had laid the architecture of my dispossession with the same methodical care he brought to his model trains in the basement. Each piece measured, glued, positioned before the next was considered, and at the bottom one line, set apart from the rest as though even he understood it needed quarantine from the language above it. Asterisk, mum doesn't need to know until it's done. I read it twice. I read it a third time with my hand over my mouth, not because I was going to scream, but because my body needed something to hold on to, and my own jaw was the closest solid thing. The front door opened. The dog's nails clicked across the hallway tile. James called out, asterisk, everything okay in there? Asterisk, in a voice so casual it could have curdled milk. I closed the browser. I turned off the monitor. I answered him the way I'd answered him 10,000 times before, with warmth I manufactured so cleanly he'd never once questioned its source. But I printed that email first. The bank statement arrived folded inside a birthday card from Carl, as if he wanted me to find it nestled between the words "with love" and "your friend always." I almost missed it. My 71st birthday had come and gone with the usual quiet. Sarah called from Portland. James texted a photograph of my granddaughter holding a crayon drawing that said Nana in wobbly purple letters. and Carl brought over a lemon cake from the bakery on 9th Street because he remembered I'd stopped baking after Harold died. Carl Meredith had been our family accountant for 32 years, and in all that time he had never once put anything inside a greeting card that wasn't a check or a gentle joke. So when I felt the extra fold of paper, stiff and clinical against the pastel envelope lining, I knew he was telling me something he couldn't say out loud. The statement was from my primary account at First Union Savings. 6 withdrawals, each between $4,000 and $7,000. Amounts carefully chosen, I would later understand, to stay just beneath the threshold that triggers automatic fraud review. I read the dates twice, then a third time. Then I set my reading glasses on the table and pressed my fingers against my eyelids until I saw sparks. Harold's birthday, October 14th. Our wedding anniversary, March 3rd, the day we brought James home from the hospital, July 19th. Every withdrawal date corresponded to a date that lived only in the private architecture of my family, not public records, not social media posts. These were the dates I circled in my kitchen calendar with the same blue pen every January, the ones I whispered to myself on morning walks when the grief sat low and heavy in my chest like river stones. Whoever had taken this money hadn't just stolen from me, they had dressed the theft in my own sorrow, timing each withdrawal so that if I ever noticed, if I ever questioned, I would second-guess myself first. I would think, maybe I did transfer that money, maybe the fog of missing Harold swallowed those hours, maybe I sat down on his birthday and moved funds somewhere I can't recall, the way I sometimes couldn't recall whether I'd locked the front door or taken my blood pressure medication. It was elegant in the cruelest possible way, a trap built from the very dates I held sacred. I called Carl that evening. He answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been waiting. He didn't ask me how my birthday was. He didn't mention the cake. He said, "Eleanor, I need you to request your full statement history going back to February. And I need you to do it in person, at the branch, with your ID. Don't call the 800 number, don't use the app." His voice carried the careful steadiness of a man trying not to frighten someone while delivering news that should terrify them. So I went. I sat across from a young woman named Priya at the downtown branch, and I asked for everything. She printed 6 months of transaction records without commentary, though I caught the way her gaze lingered on the numbers, the slight tightening at the corner of her mouth. She knew. Or she suspected, but she handed me the pages in a manila envelope and wished me a good afternoon, and I walked to my car in the parking garage and sat there for 11 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to drive. At home, I spread the statements across my kitchen table the way Harold used to spread his blueprints, methodically, chronologically, with the overhead light pulled low so nothing hid in shadow. 6 months. 14 withdrawals totaling just over $68,000. Each one carried the same electronic authorization code, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me until I cross-referenced it with the document Carl had quietly flagged in his records. A durable power of attorney, my name at the top, my signature at the bottom, except it wasn't my signature, it was close. The way a gifted student copies a master's brushstroke. Close enough for a notary who isn't looking hard. Close enough for a notary who isn't looking hard. Or a notary who's been told not to. I traced the date of notarization with my fingertip, as if the ink might confess something the document wouldn't. March 14th. A Tuesday. I didn't need a calendar to remember where I'd been that afternoon. I'd been on the 3rd floor of Mercy General with a fractured hip and a morphine drip that turned the ceiling tiles into slow-moving clouds. 2 days after my fall on the back porch steps, 4 days before I could sit upright without screaming into a folded towel, someone had walked into a notary's office on March 14th and presented a power of attorney with my name forged at the bottom, and the notary had stamped it, and the world had continued spinning as if nothing irreversible had just happened. But it was the witness line that stopped my breathing. James R. Hartfield. My son's full legal name, written in a hand I would have recognized blindfolded, the same tight, left-leaning script he'd used on every Mother's Day card since he learned cursive in Mrs. Edelman's 3rd grade class. I'd saved those cards in a shoebox in the hall closet. I could have walked 10 steps and pulled one out and held it next to this document, and the letters would have nested together like bones returning to a skeleton. I set the paper down. I picked it up. I set it down again. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a kitchen when you realize the person you would have called first with this kind of news is the person named on the page. It doesn't roar, it doesn't ring, it simply removes the oxygen from the room 1 teaspoon at a time until you notice you've been holding your breath for so long your chest aches. The withdrawals, I made myself look at them again. Carl had circled the dates in pencil, soft enough that the marks could be erased, deliberate enough that the pattern announced itself. March 22nd, Harold's birthday. April 9th, our wedding anniversary. June 2nd, the day James was born. August 15th, the date Harold died. Every single one tied to a day when grief might have made me careless, when anyone reviewing the records later could nod sympathetically and say, asterisk, of course she doesn't remember. She was probably having one of her difficult days. Asterisk, someone had chosen those dates the way a locksmith chooses tumblers, precisely, mechanically, knowing exactly which sequence would open the door to reasonable doubt about my own mind. That was the cruelty that bent me over the table. Not the money. Money is just numbers arranged in columns, and I had lived long enough to know that columns can be rebuilt. But someone who knew when Harold was born, when we married, when our son arrived, when Harold left, had weaponized my love for a dead man against me, had turned my grief into evidence of my incompetence, had counted on the world looking at a 68-year-old widow and deciding she'd simply lost track, the way old women do, the way everyone expects us to. I gathered the statements into a single stack and squared the edges the way Harold squared his blueprints when a project was finished and ready for submission. Then I slid the power of attorney on top like a title page. 6 months of theft, authorized by a document signed while I was drugged and horizontal, witnessed by my only living child. James was coming for dinner on Sunday. The bank statement arrived folded inside a sympathy card from Carl, as if the disappearance of $63,000 deserved condolences. I remember standing at the mailbox in my housecoat, the August heat pressing against my temples like a low-grade fever. The card itself was tasteful, cream linen, embossed lilies, the kind you buy when someone's mother dies. Inside, in Carl's careful printing, asterisk Eleanor, I'm sorry things got complicated. You deserve better. CM, asterisk, and tucked behind the sentiment, 3 pages of account activity printed on that thin, fibrous paper the bank uses when they want their records to feel official and unchallengeable. I carried it all inside, set the kettle on, because that was what I did when the ground shifted. I made tea. My hands knew the choreography even when the rest of me had gone somewhere quiet and inland, somewhere behind my own ribs where the air was still. $63,000. I read the number 4 times, each reading a different temperature. The first was disbelief, cool and almost clinical. The second was arithmetic, 14 months of pension deposits. The equity line, the small inheritance from my sister Ruth that I'd kept untouched for 11 years because it still smelled like her somehow, like dried lavender and library paste. The third reading was hot, a flash in my sternum, and I had to set the pages down and press both palms flat on the counter until the room stopped tilting. The fourth reading was the one that stayed. It was perfectly calm. It was the reading where I stopped being surprised and started being precise. Carl had been James's financial advisor for 6 years. James trusted him the way men of a certain generation trust other men who wear pressed shirts and know the difference between a Roth and a traditional, which is to say, completely, and without consulting their wives. I had accepted that. I had even been grateful for it, because money made me anxious, and James seemed to navigate it the way he navigated interstate highways. With an unhurried confidence I found comforting. So when Carl suggested consolidating my accounts, and James said it made sense, I signed where they pointed and moved on with my life. But here was the thing the sympathy card didn't mention. I turned to the second page, the one with the authorization forms, and there, in blue ballpoint, in the handwriting I'd watched sign our mortgage and our children's report cards and 41 years of anniversary cards, there was James's signature. Not once, not on some confused afternoon when his reading glasses were misplaced and Carl talked too fast. On every single transfer, 7 of them spanning 14 months, each one dated and witnessed and notarized with the bureaucratic neatness of someone who was not being tricked, not being rushed, not being confused. James had co-signed every authorization himself, his signature steady and unhesitating, and the earliest form was dated a full 14 months before I ever suspected a cent was missing. The kettle screamed. I turned off the burner and stood there in the steam, holding the pages like a woman reading her own autopsy report. I want to be clear about something. I did not feel rage in that moment. Rage would have been simpler, a clean fuel. something I could have burned through in an evening and a phone call to a lawyer. What I felt was a kind of structural failure, the slow recognition that a load-bearing wall in my life had been hollow the whole time, packed with newspaper instead of insulation, and I had leaned against it every single day for years without hearing the crinkle. James, my James, not duped, not passive, signatory. I turned to the third page because I owed it to myself to know everything now, to take the entire wound at once rather than let it seep in across weeks and whispered discoveries. And that was when I saw the next set of transfers. A separate account, a separate routing number, and a cosigner whose name I recognized the way you recognize your own child's handwriting on a grocery list. Because it was my daughter's. Sarah's married name sat on the authorization line in that same clinical bank typeface, but I could feel the shape of her in it the way a mother always can. Sarah Hartfield Cruz, the hyphen she had insisted on keeping, she told me once, so that part of me would travel with her into her new life. And there it was, traveling with her into this one. I did not scream. I want to be clear about that, because later, when the story got told and retold in living rooms I was no longer invited into, people assumed there had been theatrics. There were none. What happened was much quieter and much worse. I simply stopped being the woman I had been 30 seconds earlier. She evaporated. The Eleanor who believed her family was imperfect but fundamentally sound, who had accepted small betrayals as the cost of closeness, who thought the worst thing her children could do to her was forget to call on Sundays. But Eleanor set down her reading glasses and did not pick them up again. The transfers tied to Sarah's name were smaller, careful, almost clinical in their regularity. 2,000 here, 1,500 there, routed to an account I had never seen before, stretching back 11 months. Not the frantic siphoning Carl had done, where the amounts swelled with what I could only describe as appetite. Sarah's withdrawals had the rhythm of maintenance, as if she were watering a plant in a room she hoped I would never enter. I counted them twice. The total came to just under $19,000. Added to what Carl had taken with James's help, the number crossed 80,000 and kept walking. I sat with that for a long time. The kitchen light shifted from afternoon gold to something thinner, more honest, the kind of light that doesn't flatter anything. I could hear the neighbor's sprinkler starting its evening cycle, that metronomic hiss and sweep, and I remember thinking how ordinary the world sounded for a place where this was happening. $80,000. My teaching pension, my careful decades of envelopes marked asterisk vacation asterisk and asterisk roof repair asterisk and asterisk just in case asterisk, gone into accounts I couldn't access, authorized by people who kissed my cheek at Thanksgiving. The worst part, and I have had time to rank the parts, was not the money. Money is numbers, and numbers can be recovered or mourned, and eventually either outcome becomes livable. The worst part was the dates. I went back through them, matching the authorizations against my own calendar, the one I kept on the refrigerator with magnets Sarah had brought me from Puerto Rico, and I found that 3 of the largest transfers aligned with days my family had been in this house. One was signed the same week James drove me to my cataract surgery and held my hand in the waiting room, telling me everything would be clear again soon. I almost admired the architecture of it, the way care and theft had been load-bearing elements of the same structure, each one propping up the other so that neither looked like what it was. I set the papers down on the kitchen table, aligned their edges with the care of someone diffusing a device, and called Sarah. Not because I wanted comfort, not because I wanted to hear her explain or apologize or cry. I called because her husband's name was on the next page too, and I needed to know whether I was looking at a family or a syndicate. She picked up on the second ring, bright and warm, and said, asterisk, hi mum, I was just thinking about you. I believed her. The kitchen light had burned out 3 days ago, and I hadn't replaced it. I'd been sitting in that darkness each evening like it owed me something. There was a logic to it that I couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't lost what I'd lost. The darkness wasn't despair, exactly. It was more like a room I could finally be honest in. No mirrors, no windows catching my reflection and asking me to perform some version of Eleanor who had everything figured out. In the dark, I could just be the woman who'd been robbed, not just of money, but of the particular belief that she could read the people around her. That belief had been the last expensive thing I owned, and Carl Meredith had taken it along with everything else. 3 weeks had passed since I'd confronted the bank. 2 since I'd hired Diane Okafor to untangle the mess Carl had woven through my accounts. She told me to gather every piece of paper I could find, every statement, every carbon copy, every scrap with a number on it. I'd done that much. I'd pulled them from drawers and file cabinets and the old cigar box James used to keep on the dresser. I'd stacked them on the kitchen table in neat piles, organized by year like a woman preparing her own autopsy. But I hadn't opened the bank's forwarded statements. They'd arrived in a thick manila envelope 5 days prior, and I'd let them sit beside the fruit bowl like a piece of mail I could deal with on a stronger morning. Every morning since had failed to qualify. That night, though, the fourth night in the burned-out kitchen, something shifted. Not courage, something colder and more mechanical than that, a gear catching. I reached across the table in the dark, pulled the envelope toward me and tore it open by feel. Then I got up, found a flashlight in the junk drawer, and sat back down. The beam made a small white planet on the table. I started reading. Most of what I found confirmed what Diane and I already suspected. Unauthorized transfers, accounts opened in James's name months after his stroke had rendered him unable to sign his own birthday cards. Carl's penmanship was everywhere, that blocky, impatient hand of his, the letters like little fences. I knew it well. I'd watched him sign Christmas cards at our table for 6 years running, back when I still thought he was a friend of this family rather than its surgeon. But then I turned to a cosigner authorization dated 14 months ago, and the room changed temperature. The form had James's name on the signature line, forged. Obviously, James hadn't held a pen with any purpose since the second stroke took the right side of his body and most of his speech. I'd seen a dozen forgeries by now. Carl's handiwork. I was ready to add it to the pile. Except it wasn't Carl's handwriting. I moved the flashlight closer. The letters were rounder, more fluid. There was a grace to them that Carl's hand had never possessed. The ink pressed deeper on the downstrokes, a habit of someone who'd learned penmanship with a fountain pen, the way I'd taught. I stopped. My breath stopped with me. I held the flashlight so still that the beam didn't tremble, and I read the signature again. James Hartfield. The capital J swept upward with a particular flourish, then looped back on itself before descending, a small calligraphic vanity that James himself had always performed. It was a perfect reproduction, not a tracing, a performance. Someone who had internalized the motion of that letter the way a musician memorizes a phrase. Someone who had practiced it not to forge it, but to become it, years and years before any crime was conceivable. My mouth filled with something metallic. My hand, the one not holding the flashlight, pressed flat against the table as if the kitchen floor had just pitched sideways. I knew that handwriting. I knew it the way I knew the sound of my own back door, closing, a particular rhythm, unmistakable once you'd heard it enough times. The J didn't just resemble James's signature, it carried the ghost of someone learning to write by imitation, the way children do, pressing their pencils too hard into the paper because they believe that commitment is the same as accuracy. Sarah had done that, 8 years old, maybe 9, sitting across from James at this table while he signed birthday cards and permission slips and checks for the oil company. She'd watched his hand the way a cat watches a bird. Total absorption, total stillness. And then she'd pull her own notebook close and try to replicate what she'd seen. Not because anyone asked her to, because she adored him, because she wanted to carry some piece of her father inside the mechanics of her own hand. I had thought it was sweet. I had saved some of those practice sheets in a box in the hall closet, the way mothers save teeth and crayon drawings and hospital bracelets. Evidence of love, that's what I'd called it. I stood there in the dark kitchen with the flashlight making a white circle on the bank document, and I felt something I had no name for. It wasn't anger. Anger would have been a mercy, something clean with edges I could hold. This was more like the sensation of stepping off a curb you believed was there and finding only air. The falling hadn't started yet. I was just suspended, my body understanding before my mind caught up that the ground was no longer where I'd left it. Carl Meredith was a thief. I had accepted that. I had metabolized that betrayal the way you metabolize a slow poison. Incrementally, with damage, but with a kind of grim order. He was my financial advisor. He had exploited my trust and my husband's declining faculties. The narrative was ugly, but it was navigable. It had a villain, and the villain was external. But this cosigner authorization hadn't been filed by Carl alone. The document required a secondary party, someone with enough access to James's accounts to appear credible, someone who knew the rhythms of this family's finances from the inside, who knew which accounts were dormant, which statements I never opened because James had always handled them, which passwords hadn't been changed since 2014 because neither of us could remember new ones. Carl couldn't have known all of that, not without help. I pulled out the chair, the one with the loose spindle that James had promised to fix for 11 years, and I lowered myself into it because my knees had made the decision for me. The bank statements fanned across the table in the flashlight's beam, and I noticed details I'd missed in the first reading. The authorization was dated the same month Sarah had started driving James to his Tuesday appointments, the same month she'd offered to help organize our financial paperwork, arriving with folders and color-coded tabs and that competent, daughterly efficiency I had praised at the time. I had praised her for it. The flashlight dimmed, the batteries were going, or my hand was shaking enough to make it seem so. I set the paper down on the table with both hands, the way you'd lower something explosive. The loops on that signature, the way the J curled back on itself like a habit. I had watched Sarah practice that letter 1,000 times as a girl, sitting at this very table, trying to write just like her father. I clicked the flashlight off. The darkness didn't feel like it owed me anything anymore. It felt like it had paid in full. My daughter. The bank officer's hands were shaking worse than mine, and I'd been the one robbed. Her name was Diane Okafor, and she sat behind a desk cluttered with forms I didn't understand, her fingers trembling over a stack of printouts that told the story of my disappearing life. I watched her flip through page after page, each one stamped with dates and dollar amounts that had been mine, my teaching pension, my individual retirement account, the small inheritance my mother had left me when she died in that antiseptic room in Tucson. All of it routed, redirected, siphoned through authorizations I had never seen, into accounts I had never opened. Diane kept apologizing, kept smoothing the papers flat as though neatness might soften what they contained. I told her she didn't need to apologize. She hadn't taken anything from me. She looked relieved, and then immediately guilty for feeling relieved. And I recognized that particular shade of helplessness because I had been wearing it for weeks. Carl Meredith's name appeared on nearly every document. My financial advisor, the man Sarah had recommended, the man who'd sat in my living room drinking the chamomile tea I brewed for him while he explained, with that careful patience people reserve for the elderly and the slow, how consolidating my accounts would protect me. I had trusted him the way you trust a handrail, without thinking, because it was there, because someone had installed it for exactly that purpose. Diane confirmed what I had already suspected. Carl had moved over $340,000 out of my accounts in 14 months. She said the compliance team was escalating the matter. She said I should contact an attorney. She said a lot of things I wrote down on the back of a grocery receipt because I hadn't thought to bring a notebook, because when I'd left the house that morning I still believed I was coming in to correct a clerical error. But then Diane paused. She turned one of the authorization forms toward me, and her finger hovered above a line near the bottom, a co-signatory line. And the signature there wasn't Carl's looping scrawl. It was a handwriting I knew better than my own, tighter, more deliberate, the capital J like a fishhook, the way he'd always made it, on birthday cards, on mortgage papers, on the note he'd slipped into my suitcase the first time I traveled without him. James, my James. His signature sat on that line like a confession dressed in ink, authorizing Carl Meredith full fiduciary access to every retirement account under my name. I drove home with the windows down because the air inside the car felt used up. I carried the photocopies Diane had made for me in a manila envelope pressed against my chest, and I could feel the pages through the paper, warm from the printer, alive with something I didn't want to name yet. The kitchen light was on when I pulled into the driveway. James was sitting at the table with a glass of water he wasn't drinking. He looked up when I came in, and I saw it. Not surprise, not confusion, but the dull recognition of a man who had been waiting for this particular door to open. I set the envelope on the table between us. I didn't raise my voice. I was 68 years old, and I had learned, somewhere between my mother's funeral and this moment, that volume solves nothing. I asked him once, plainly, "Did you sign this?" He pressed both palms flat against the table like he needed to hold himself to something solid, and then the rest of it came, not in a flood, but in a slow, terrible leak. The gambling, online at first, then the casino in Biloxi, then the debts that bred like something feral in the dark. Over a decade he had carried it, hidden it, let it metastasize until Carl appeared with a solution that was really just a different kind of disease. Carl had offered to clear the debt. All James had to do was sign one line, one signature, one door left open for someone who already knew exactly what was on the other side. I sat there and I listened. I listened the way you listen to a doctor delivering results you suspected but prayed against. James talked about the first bet, a $50 wager on a Sunday football game, harmless as a paper cut. He talked about the way it grew, The way the numbers stopped meaning anything because the screen made them feel like a game. He talked about the cash advances and the second credit card I never knew existed, and the line of equity he'd drawn against the house. Our house, the one with the garden I'd built with my own 2 hands over 30 years of Saturdays. He talked about the night he sat in his truck in the casino parking lot in Biloxi and wept until his chest hurt and then walked back inside anyway. He told me all of it in that same flat, emptied-out voice, the way a man speaks when he's already spent every feeling he had and there's nothing left but the architecture of the thing, the bare facts holding each other up like bones. And I did not interrupt. Not once, because I needed to hear the shape of it before I decided what it meant. When he finished, the kitchen was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator cycling. I could hear a mockingbird outside the window doing what mockingbirds do, borrowing someone else's song and making it sound convincing. I thought about that bird for a moment longer than made sense. Then I looked at the documents again. The authorization form, James's signature, that familiar leftward slant I'd seen on anniversary cards and mortgage papers and the birth certificate addendum when Sarah was born. The same hand, the same man, used for something that undid 41 years of whatever I thought we'd been building together. I asked him how much. He told me. $312,000, nearly every cent of my retirement, the money from my years at the county clerk's office, the pension I'd contributed to since I was 29 years old, the savings account my mother had seeded with $600 the year I got married, all of it rerouted through Carl's maze of accounts, laundered through investment vehicles that existed only on paper, spent before I ever knew it was gone. I remember thinking the number should have made me scream. It didn't. It sat inside me like a stone dropped into still water. The splash was almost nothing, but the weight kept sinking, pressing down into places I hadn't known were there. James started to cry, not the performative kind, the ugly kind, where the face loses all its composure and the sound that comes out doesn't even resemble the person you know. I had seen James cry exactly 3 times in 4 decades, when his father died, when Sarah was born, and when our dog was hit on Route 9. This was different. This was a man watching himself be known, fully, for the first time, and finding the experience unsurvivable. I did not reach for his hand. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the wife to reach across the table, to find the grace, to begin the long, redemptive work of forgiveness before the wound has even stopped bleeding. But I was 68 years old and I had just learned that the ground I stood on was not ground at all but a trap door. And the man I loved had built it. I looked at James across that kitchen table, at the jaw I'd traced with my fingers in the dark, at the shoulders that had carried our daughter when she was small, at the hands that were shaking now like leaves in a storm they'd invited, and I understood something that nearly split me open. He hadn't been Carl's victim. He hadn't been Carl's accomplice. He had been Carl's door, left unlocked on purpose, and he couldn't even meet my eyes long enough to deny it. The mockingbird outside went silent, as if even it had run out of borrowed songs. I stood up, and I left the room, and I closed the door so gently it barely made a sound. That was the cruelest thing. The courtroom smelled like old carpet and someone's forgotten lunch, and I sat there thinking how strange it was that the place where your life gets weighed should feel so ordinary. I'd imagined something grander, marble, maybe, wood paneling dark enough to absorb all the ugly things people said inside those walls. Instead, the ceiling tiles had water stains shaped like continents nobody had discovered, and the fluorescent light above the witness stand flickered with a faint, maddening rhythm that made everything feel like a waiting room for bad news, which I supposed it was. Carl sat 12 feet from me. I'd counted. He wore a navy suit I'd never seen before, and he'd gotten a haircut, trimmed close at the temples the way men do when they want to look trustworthy. His attorney, a woman with sharp cheekbones and reading glasses she used like a weapon, had spent the first 40 minutes turning my life into a series of polite questions. How old was I when I first noticed difficulty managing my accounts? Whether I'd ever been diagnosed with cognitive decline? If I understood the difference between a gift and a transaction? Each question landed like a paper cut, small, precise, designed to sting later when you weren't expecting it. I answered them all. I kept my hands folded in my lap the way my mother taught me, though my mother never anticipated I'd need that composure in a courtroom explaining how a man I'd trusted had hollowed out my savings like a bird gutting a fish. I spoke slowly, not because I couldn't think, but because I wanted every word to arrive clean. Diane had told me the night before that clarity was my sharpest instrument. She was right. She usually was. But then the defense attorney lifted a single sheet of paper from her table, and everything I'd built, every careful answer, every measured breath, tilted sideways. She introduced it as Exhibit 14, a letter, she said, written in my handwriting, on my personal stationery, the cream-colored linen stock with the pale green border that James had custom-ordered for my 70th birthday. I recognized the color before I recognized the words. She held it up, and the light caught the texture of the paper, and my stomach folded in on itself, because I knew that stationery the way I knew the weight of my own wedding ring. It was the note I'd written Carl 3 years earlier, after he helped me sort through James's estate taxes that first spring. I remembered writing it at the kitchen table, the windows open, dogwood petals drifting across the porch like small surrenders. I'd been grateful, genuinely, achingly grateful, because the numbers had been drowning me and Carl had made them make sense. I remembered choosing my words carefully, the way you do when someone has done you a kindness you can't repay. I'd wanted him to know I valued him. His attorney read selected phrases to the courtroom. I am so relieved to have someone I can depend on. And, please don't hesitate to handle whatever you think is best. And the room shifted. I could feel it, the slight recalibration of strangers deciding what kind of woman I was. Not a victim, a willing participant, a woman who'd handed over the keys and then complained about where the car ended up. The language had been gratitude, just gratitude, but stripped from the context of a thank you note and pressed into the architecture of a legal defense. My words became authorization, consent, permission granted. I wanted to stand and say that a woman thanking someone for their help is not the same as a woman signing away her life. But Diane's hand found my elbow, a gentle pressure that meant wait, so I waited, my pulse ticking behind my eyes. The judge, a man with deep lines around his mouth, who looked like he'd heard 10,000 lies and had stopped being surprised by any of them, turned to me. He asked if I recognized the letter. I said I did. He asked if the handwriting was mine. I said it was. Then he asked me to read it aloud. I took the letter in both hands because one hand alone would have shown the trembling. The paper was heavier than I remembered. That cream stationery I'd ordered from a catalogue in Vermont the year Robert died, because I'd needed something beautiful to hold on to, even if it was only paper. I'd written dozens of notes on it, condolence replies, birthday wishes to the grandchildren, and this one to Carl, after he'd sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours untangling the mess Robert's accountant had left behind. I read it the way Diane had told me to read it, slowly, every word given its own breath. Dear Carl, I cannot tell you what a relief it has been to have your steady hand guiding me through this maze. Robert always handled the finances, and without him I felt like a woman trying to read a map in another language. My voice held. I was surprised by that. I'd expected it to fracture, but something in me had gone very still, the way a lake goes still before weather moves across it. Your patience with my questions, your willingness to explain things twice and never make me feel foolish. These are gifts I do not take lightly. Carl was watching me. I could feel it without looking. That particular quality of attention he had, the kind that made you believe you were the only person in any room he'd ever entered. I had mistaken that attention for kindness. For years I had mistaken it. I am grateful to have someone I can lean on during this difficult season. Please know that I trust you completely, Carl, as I would family. The last 6 words fell into the courtroom like stones dropped into shallow water. I heard them ripple outward. I heard the shift in breathing behind me. Sarah's breath, sharp and caught, a small animal sound she couldn't pull back in time. I set the letter down on the wooden railing in front of me and looked at the judge. He was writing something. He didn't look up immediately, and in that gap of silence I understood what Sarah had understood, what had made her breath snag like fabric on a nail. She had said those words to Carl too. Not in a letter, not on cream stationery from Vermont. She'd said them in my living room. The afternoon she'd thanked him for convincing me to let him consolidate my accounts. She'd stood in the doorway with her coat half on and said, "We trust you completely, Carl, your family," and he'd smiled that careful smile and nodded as if the words were a gift he hadn't expected, when really they were a key he'd been waiting for someone to hand him. He had collected our trust like currency, stacked it, spent it. I looked at Sarah then. I turned in my seat and found her face 3 rows back, and what I saw there was not pity and not anger. It was recognition. The kind that comes when you realize you and someone you love were robbed by the same hands using the same tools, and that the tool was your own open heart. Diane stood to cross-examine. She buttoned her jacket with one hand, a gesture so casual it almost hid the precision underneath. She asked me one question, just one, before she turned to Carl's attorney. Mrs. Hartfield, in that letter, did you authorize anyone to sell your home, liquidate your retirement accounts, or transfer funds to accounts bearing a name other than your own? No, I said, I did not. Diane nodded and picked up a folder thick enough to stop a door. The folder contained 14 months of wire transfers, every one of them signed with a version of my name that wasn't quite my handwriting. The courtroom smelled like old wood polish and recycled air, and Carl Meredith sat 12 feet from me wearing the same cologne he'd worn to my husband's funeral. I recognized it the way you recognize a song from a terrible year, not by wanting to, but because your body remembers what your mind tried to archive. Sandalwood and something citrus. He'd leaned close at the graveside, his hand on my shoulder, and told me Arthur would want me taken care of. That was the seed, that was where it started. And now I sat in a courtroom with a manila folder on my lap, watching the back of his neck where his barber had missed a spot, and I thought, you are smaller than I remembered. Diane sat at the plaintiff's table beside me, her posture a kind of architecture, upright, deliberate, nothing wasted. She'd warned me the morning would feel surgical. She said hearings like this rarely had drama, that the numbers did the bleeding for you. I appreciated the metaphor, even if she turned out to be wrong about the drama. Carl's attorney was a woman named Prager with a voice like a weathercast, smooth, designed to be trusted. She walked the judge through Carl's credentials, his years of service to clients, his deep personal bond with the Hartfield family. I watched her mouth form words that made me sound like a project, a charity case, an elderly woman adrift after loss, grateful to be guided. I kept my hands still. Diane had told me the judge would notice my hands. Then Prager introduced the letter. She described it as a character reference, a corroborating statement from a family member with direct knowledge of my condition and Carl's involvement. She said the name, and for a moment the syllables didn't assemble into anything I understood. James Hartfield. My son, my firstborn child, whose forehead I had kissed through every fever, whose college essays I had proofread at midnight, whose wedding toast I had memorized so I wouldn't cry through it. James had written a letter for Carl Meredith's defense. Diane's hand found my wrist under the table, not a comfort, an anchor. Prager read selections. James described my confusion after Arthur's death, my repeating of questions, my inability to manage basic financial tasks. He wrote that Carl had stepped into a vacuum the family couldn't fill. He wrote that I had grown paranoid, suspicious, prone to misremembering conversations. He used the phrase asterisk, diminished capacity asterisk, like it was a clinical term and not a grenade lobbed into the center of my chest. None of it was true. Some of it was adjacent to true, which was worse. I had repeated questions. I had been confused. Grief does that. It puts static in your signal for a while. But I had not lost my mind. I had lost my money, and there is a specific, clarifying fury in knowing the difference. Sarah sat on my other side, and I felt her go rigid, the way a wire goes rigid before it snaps. She didn't speak, she didn't move, but the air around her changed temperature. I looked across the courtroom at James. He was in the second row behind Carl's table, wearing a blue blazer I didn't recognize. His hair was thinner than the last time I'd seen him. His hands were clasped in his lap the way Arthur used to clasp his during sermons, thumbs circling each other, a quiet orbit of anxiety. I waited for him to drop his gaze. I wanted him to. I wanted the small mercy of his shame, some evidence that the boy I'd raised still lived somewhere behind that blazer and those circling thumbs. But James looked back at me, and he didn't flinch. What I saw in his face wasn't guilt. It wasn't defiance either, or cruelty, or even the blankness of someone who'd convinced himself he'd done right. It was something I had no word for, something between resignation and hunger, as if he'd made a trade he couldn't undo and was already starving from it. I'd seen that look once before, on Arthur's face the afternoon he told me the pension was gone. Not the confession itself, but the moment after, when the words had left him and he realized they could never be taken back. That look said, asterisk, I know exactly what I've done, and I'd do it again, and that's the part I can't live with. It frightened me more than any number Carl had ever stolen. Numbers could be recovered, or at least mourned in their precise absence, but whatever lived behind my son's eyes had no ledger, no column where I could enter it and know its cost. The hearing continued. Carl's attorney, a woman with silver-framed glasses and a voice like someone reading terms and conditions, walked the judge through a timeline I barely recognized. She spoke of my episodes, my increasing disorientation, the time I'd left a burner on and the fire department came, which was true, but it had been one afternoon in November of 2019, and I'd been grieving, not dissolving. She made it sound clinical. She made it sound inevitable, the way weather reporters talk about hurricanes that haven't landed yet. Then she introduced the letter. I didn't understand at first. I heard submitted in support of Mr. Meredith's position and signed by the complainant's eldest child, and the words reached me the way sound travels underwater, muffled, delayed, arriving just after the pressure. Diane's hand found my forearm. I felt her fingers tighten, but I couldn't look at her. I was watching the judge's clerk carry a single sheet of paper to the bench, and I was thinking absurdly about the stationery. Whether James had used the cream-colored stock I'd given him one Christmas, the set with his initials embossed at the top, whether he'd written the words in his own hand or typed them and signed at the bottom the way you sign a permission slip for a field trip. Quickly, without reading, the attorney read selections aloud. James described my confusion after Arthur's death. He described finding unopened bills in my kitchen drawer. He described a phone call, I remembered this call, in which I'd repeated myself 3 times without noticing. He described these things accurately, and that was the cruelest part. He hadn't lied. He'd simply built a house out of true bricks and arranged them into a shape that bore no resemblance to the home I'd actually lived in. Every fact was correct. The structure was a forgery. Carl sat with his hands flat on the table, palms down, as though holding something in place. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. My own son had handed him the architecture of my diminishment, and it fit the narrative so neatly that even I, sitting there, felt a flicker of doubt, the kind that crawls under your sternum and asks, what if they're right? What if you really are what they say? I killed it. I killed it the way you kill a wasp in a room where a child is sleeping, swiftly, without ceremony, because the alternative is unacceptable. I looked at James again. He looked back, 12 feet and a lifetime of Saturdays between us, and neither of us blinked. Then Sarah leaned toward me and whispered 4 words that rearranged everything. James called me yesterday. The courtroom smelled like old carpet and someone's forgotten lunch, and I remember thinking that was a strange backdrop for the moment my whole life got handed back to me. Diane sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, her folders arranged in that meticulous architecture she favored, color-coded tabs, post-it flags in 3 shades of yellow. I'd learnt to read her body language over the months we'd worked together, and that morning she carried herself with the coiled stillness of someone who already knew the outcome but refused to celebrate prematurely. I admired that about her. I'd spent too many years celebrating things before they were real. Carl Meredith sat across the aisle. He wore a charcoal suit I recognized, the same one he'd worn to my 65th birthday dinner, the evening he'd first mentioned the annuity restructuring over flourless chocolate cake. He didn't look at me. He studied his own hands as though they belonged to someone else, turning them over on the table, examining the fingernails. His lawyer, a thin woman with reading glasses perpetually sliding down her nose, leaned into him and whispered something that made his jaw tighten. The judge hadn't entered yet. We waited in that purgatorial silence that courtrooms specialize in, too quiet for comfort, too charged for peace. Then his lawyer stood and approached the bench clerk, requesting a sidebar conference. Diane stiffened beside me. She placed one hand flat on her stack of folders. A gesture I'd come to understand meant she was anchoring herself against something she hadn't anticipated. They huddled near the bench. Diane, Carl's lawyer, the clerk relaying to the judge's chambers through a cracked door. I couldn't hear most of it. But courtroom acoustics are strange, unreliable things. Sound travels along the wood paneling in ways architects never intended. I heard Carl's lawyer say the words full return of funds. My heart lurched. I heard her say structured timeline. I heard good faith. And then, more clearly than anything else, I heard this. My client is prepared to make complete restitution in exchange for Mrs. Hartfield's signed statement acknowledging that Mr. Meredith acted in good faith and within the scope of his fiduciary duties as she understood them at the time. The words arrived in my chest before my mind could process them. He wasn't surrendering. He wasn't sorry. He was purchasing a sentence, one specific, carefully constructed sentence that would let him keep his license, keep his reputation, keep the story he'd built around what he'd done to me. He wanted to give back every dollar he'd taken, but only if I agreed to say he'd never really taken anything at all. I looked at him then, and he finally looked at me. His expression wasn't guilt, it wasn't even anxiety, it was calculation. The same expression he'd worn when he'd explained to me that moving my retirement funds into his managed trust was just housekeeping. I recognized it the way you recognize a dog that's bitten you once, not with fear exactly, but with a clarity that rearranges every memory you have of it. Diane returned to the table. She sat down, uncapped her pen, and wrote on her legal pad in letters large enough for me to read without my glasses, "We say no." I nodded. She wrote beneath it, "We get everything, on our terms." I nodded again, and something settled in my sternum, not triumph, not relief, but the particular solidity of a woman who has finally stopped being managed. The feeling was quieter than I'd imagined, smaller. It fit in the palm of my hand like a smooth stone, warm from being held too long. We declined the offer through proper channels. The judge noted it for the record. Carl's lawyer requested a continuance. Diane objected. The proceedings would resume in 10 days. I gathered my coat, my purse, the small notebook I'd started carrying everywhere so I could write down things I didn't want to forget. Diane walked beside me through the corridor, her heels marking a rhythm I'd come to find steadying over these months. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing performative about the silence. It was the kind two people share when the work isn't finished, but the day's portion of it is done well. The courthouse hallway had that particular fluorescent pallor that makes everyone look like they haven't slept. I caught my reflection in a glass partition near the elevator. An older woman in a navy blazer she'd pressed that morning, holding her coat over one arm like a shield she no longer needed but wasn't ready to set down. I looked tired. I looked intact. Those aren't the same thing, but I'd learned to value both. We pushed through the double doors at the building's entrance, and the October air hit my face with that first honest cold of the season. I buttoned my coat on the top step and turned to Diane to say something. I don't remember what, probably something small about the 10-day timeline, or where we'd meet next, when she touched my elbow and tilted her head back toward the doors. Carl was standing just inside the glass, watching us. His lawyer had a hand on his shoulder, leaning close, murmuring something. But Carl wasn't listening. He was looking directly at me with an expression I'd seen before, in the early days, when he'd sit across my kitchen table and say things like, "Asterisk, you deserve someone paying attention to this asterisk, and asterisk let me worry about the details." That expression, earnest, calibrated. A face designed to make you feel ungrateful for doubting it. I held his gaze for exactly as long as I wanted to, which was 3 seconds. Then I turned away. Not dramatically. Not with any gesture he could later describe as hostile or unhinged. I simply stopped looking at him the way I'd eventually stopped looking at all the things in my life that had been arranged to keep me small. Diane said she'd call me that evening to discuss next steps. She said the word asterisk, restitution asterisk, like it was something she could see, something with edges and weight that she intended to place in my hands. I believed her, not because I was naive. I'd spent 18 months being cured of that. But because Diane had never once asked me to trust her. She'd just done the work and let the work speak. I started down the courthouse steps. 12 of them, concrete, cracked along the left side where a tree root had been pushing up for years. I counted them because I count things now. It helps me stay in the moment instead of drifting into the version of events someone else would prefer I remember. On the 9th step, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I almost didn't look. I'd been disciplined about that lately, not letting every vibration yank me out of wherever I was standing. But something made me reach for it. Maybe the hour. Maybe the fact that Sarah hadn't texted all day, which was unusual during a court week. She always texted. Small things. Asterisk, thinking of you. A photograph of my granddaughter's crayon drawings. Proof of life. Proof of love. Delivered in fragments throughout the afternoon. The screen was bright against the grey sky. One message. Asterisk, Mum. James is in the hospital. The stone in my sternum dropped straight through my body and shattered somewhere below my feet. Every careful, hard-won thing I'd rebuilt in that courtroom, the composure, the clarity, the quiet authority of a woman who'd finally stopped being managed, all of it became weightless and useless in the space between one heartbeat and the one that wouldn't come. I stood on the 9th step and couldn't remember how to reach the 10th. The bank statement arrived folded inside a birthday card from Carl, as if the numbers themselves were something to celebrate. I remember the card had a watercolor heron on the front, long-necked and wading through some artist's idea of peace. Inside, Carl had written, "Happy 68th, Eleanor. You deserve every good thing." His penmanship was careful, almost architectural, the way men write when they want you to believe they've taken their time. The statement slipped out when I opened the card over my morning coffee, landing face up on the kitchen table like a card dealt from the bottom of a deck. I didn't understand it at first. The account number wasn't one I recognized. The name at the top was mine, Eleanor R. Hartfield. But the bank was a regional institution 2 counties over, a place I'd never walked into, never called, never heard of outside a highway billboard I vaguely recalled passing on the drive to Sarah's house. The balance was $1,100 and change, small enough to seem insignificant, except for the transaction history beneath it, which told a different kind of story. Withdrawals in clean round numbers, 500 here, 1,000 there, stretching back 14 months. The deposits that preceded them were larger, irregular, routed from my brokerage account through a transfer mechanism I hadn't authorized. The total moved through that account over those 14 months was just under $91,000. I sat with it. I made myself sit with it the way I'd learned to sit with difficult truths after James died, not rushing toward panic, not retreating into denial, but letting the information settle into my body like sediment finding the bottom of a glass. My hands were steady, my breathing was even. I was proud of that, in the moment, though later I'd wonder whether steadiness in the face of betrayal was wisdom, or just another form of numbness I'd perfected over a long life of accommodating other people's messes. I called no one. Instead, I drove to the county clerk's office that afternoon, wearing the navy cardigan Sarah had given me last Christmas, and a pair of reading glasses I kept specifically for fine print. I asked the woman at the counter, young, patient, with braids pinned in a crown around her head, to help me pull any documents filed under my name in the past 2 years. She brought me 3. 2 were unremarkable, related to property tax adjustments on the house. The third was a durable power of attorney, notarized 11 months ago, granting Carl Meredith broad financial authority over my affairs. It covered banking, investments, real estate transactions. It was comprehensive in the way that only deliberate things are comprehensive. Every clause accounted for, every loophole sealed. Carl's signature was at the bottom, right where I expected it, but it was the second signature that emptied the air from my lungs. Sarah Hartfield Cruz, my daughter, listed as witness and co-petitioner, her signature flowing and slightly left-leaning, the lowercase letters round the way I'd shaped them when she was 7 years old at the kitchen table, guiding her hand across wide-ruled paper while the radio played something I can't remember now. She had co-signed this document. She had stood in some office or at some notary's desk, watched Carl file paperwork that gave him the keys to my financial life, and she had picked up a pen and made it legal. I thought about calling her. I picked up my phone in the parking lot and stared at her name in my contacts. Just Sarah, no last name needed. The way you list the people who are supposed to be permanent, but I couldn't make my thumb move because calling her meant hearing her voice, and hearing her voice meant she'd have a reason, and the reason would either break my heart or insult my intelligence, and I wasn't sure which outcome I could survive that afternoon. The drive home took 40 minutes. I don't remember the road. I remember the weight of the document on the passenger seat beside me, the pages held together with a paperclip the clerk had provided, the late afternoon sun making the ink on Sarah's signature glow like something holy, which was the cruelest trick the light had ever played. I parked in my driveway and sat there with the engine running, the way I used to sit after James's funeral, not ready to walk into a house that would be empty in a new way. But this was different. After James died, the silence was an absence. Now the silence felt like evidence. Every quiet Sunday dinner, every time Sarah had kissed my cheek and asked how I was managing, every phone call where she told me Carl was just helping with the boring stuff. Mum, you shouldn't have to worry about numbers at your age. The word worry had been doing so much heavy lifting in that sentence, and I'd let it, because trusting your daughter isn't supposed to require effort. It's supposed to be the one thing you get to do without thinking. Inside, I spread the documents across the kitchen table the way James used to spread his woodworking blueprints, measured, deliberate, 1 page at a time. The power of attorney was dated 14 months earlier, 3 weeks after my hip surgery, when I'd been in Sarah's guest bedroom on painkillers that made the ceiling swim. I remembered those weeks in fragments. Carl bringing me soup I hadn't asked for, Sarah handling my mail so I wouldn't have to bend, the two of them murmuring in the hallway after they thought I'd fallen asleep. I'd found their murmuring comforting at the time. I'd thought they were coordinating my care. The document authorized Carl Meredith, not Sarah, Carl, to open accounts, transfer funds, and manage assets on my behalf. There were 3 accounts I'd never seen before, opened at 2 different banks, and money had flowed through them like water through a series of locks. Each transfer small enough to avoid the kind of flags that make compliance officers pick up their phones. Whoever had designed it understood patience. I'll give them that. They understood the arithmetic of erosion, that you don't need to steal a river if you can redirect it a cup at a time, but it was the power of attorney that I kept returning to. Page 4. Bottom of the section labeled Grantor Authorization. My name typed in neat block letters above a signature line, and below it, in the space marked Witness, Sarah's name, written in her own hand, the looping cursive she'd perfected in 3rd grade at the kitchen table where I now sat. She'd always made her capital S the same way I did, with that little flourish at the top that James said looked like a treble clef. I'd been so proud of that. I'd held her hand over the practice sheets and guided her fingers until the letters came out steady, and she'd looked up at me with her front teeth missing and said, "It looks like yours, Mama." It did. It still did. I noticed something else then. The grantor's signature, the one that was supposed to be mine, authorizing all of it, wasn't mine. It was close enough to fool a notary who wasn't looking hard, close enough to pass in a stack of paperwork processed on a busy Tuesday afternoon. But the S was wrong. It had that flourish, that little treble clef, and my hand hadn't made the S that way in over a decade. I'd stopped after arthritis reshaped my grip. Only someone working from memory would have written it like that. Someone who'd learnt the letter young and never noticed it had changed. I set the paper down carefully, the way you handle something that might detonate, and read Sarah's signature one more time. Her handwriting identical to mine, because I was the one who taught her to write. She hadn't just witnessed the document, she'd signed my name on it too. The courtroom smelled like furniture polish and old paper, and I sat in the gallery with my hands folded over a purse that held exactly $11. I'd chosen the navy dress, the one with the buttons that still caught light if I sat up straight. Vanity maybe, or maybe it was something closer to armor. Diane had told me to wear whatever made me feel like myself, and that dress had outlasted 2 presidents and a hip replacement, so it seemed right for the occasion. The oak benches in that courtroom had been worn smooth by decades of people waiting for someone to believe them, and I could feel every one of those people in the grain beneath my palms. Carl sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit I'd never seen, his hair freshly cut, his posture arranged into the shape of a man with nothing to hide. He didn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me since I'd entered the room, which told me everything his lawyer was about to spend the next hour trying to obscure. Guilty men study the ceiling. Guilty men memorize their own shoes. Carl Meredith studied a legal pad with the concentration of a man performing innocence for an audience. Diane had laid our case out that morning with the patience of someone stitching a quilt. Each piece small, each piece deliberate, each piece meaningless until you stood back and saw what they formed together. The bank records, the forged checks, the retirement account that had hemorrhaged $63,000 in 14 months while I'd been told my statements were being sent to a new address for my convenience. She spoke the way I wished I could have spoken to James in those last years, plainly, without apology, as though the truth required no decoration. Then Carl's attorney stood. His name was Leland Price, a man built like a mailbox with a voice designed to make reasonable things sound unreasonable and unreasonable things sound like common sense. He didn't attack Diane's evidence directly. Instead, he pivoted. He told the judge that this was a misunderstanding born of an aging woman's confusion, that Carl had operated within the bounds of a legal agreement Eleanor Hartfield herself had authorized. He paused for effect, then produced a single document, a revised power of attorney, broader in scope than anything I would have ever agreed to, granting Carl access to accounts I hadn't known he could touch. And at the bottom, my signature. My actual signature. I felt the floor shift beneath me, not literally, but in that way a body registers betrayal before the mind can catch up. Because I recognized the handwriting, the slight hook on the E, the way my L leaned too far left, the ink, blue, not black, the way I always preferred. It was mine. I knew it was mine. And for one terrible, vertiginous moment, I wondered if I had signed it, if my memory had failed me the way everyone kept suggesting it might. But then I remembered. A Tuesday afternoon 3 years earlier, Carl at my kitchen table spreading papers out beside the sugar bowl. An insurance form, he'd said. Routine, he'd said. He'd pointed to a blank line at the bottom of a page and told me it was for the supplemental rider on my homeowner's policy, and I'd signed it without reading because James had always handled the insurance and Carl was handling it now, and I had soup on the stove. I remembered the soup, butternut squash. I remembered the steam on the window and how Carl had slid the paper into his briefcase before I'd even set the pen down. He'd kept that page. He'd kept my signature on a blank sheet for 3 years, waiting for the moment he'd need to graft my consent onto a document I'd never seen, never read, never agreed to. I opened my mouth to say this, to explain, but what proof did I have? A memory of soup, a feeling in my chest. I was 68 years old in a courtroom that smelled like someone else's history, and Leland Price was already turning to the judge with his pal, open, ready to bury me under the weight of my own penmanship. "Your Honor," Price said, and his voice had that particular smoothness that men use when they believe they've already won. "Mrs. Hartfield signed this document freely. The signature is authentic. She has not disputed that. What we have here is an elderly woman experiencing regret, perhaps confusion, about a financial arrangement she entered into voluntarily during a period of grief." I watched the judge's face. She was younger than Sarah, maybe 45, with reading glasses pushed up into dark hair and an expression I couldn't decode. She looked at me the way you look at a cracked vase, assessing whether the damage was structural or cosmetic. Carl sat at the defendant's table in a navy suit I was fairly certain I'd paid for. He didn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me once since I'd entered the courtroom, and that absence of eye contact told me more than any stolen document could. Guilt has a posture. It sits very still and studies the middle distance like it's reading something fascinating on the wall. Diane, sitting to my left, placed a hand on the table and made a small steadying motion, not to me but to herself. She told me that morning that the forged power of attorney was the hinge. If the judge accepted it as legitimate, everything Carl had taken would retroactively become legal. The house, the annuity, the joint account James and I had built over 41 years of modest, deliberate living, all of it signed away on a page I'd endorsed next to a pot of butternut squash soup, thinking I was updating an insurance rider. "Mrs. Hartfield," the judge said, turning to me with a directness that felt almost physical, "do you have any evidence, documentation, a witness, anything at all, that this signature was originally affixed to a different document than the one presented here today?" The courtroom went quiet in that particular way that only happens when everyone present understands that the next few seconds will determine everything. I could hear the ventilation system. I could hear Price's pen tapping once against his legal pad, then stopping, as if even he wanted to listen. I opened my mouth. I had the memory. I had the soup, the steam, the briefcase snapping shut. I had the truth sitting in my chest like a stone I couldn't lift high enough for anyone else to see. But the truth and proof are not the same animal, and I had spent 8 months learning that difference the way you learn the depth of a lake by going under. I started to speak. I started to say, "I remember what I signed that day," knowing even as the words formed that memory is not evidence, that an old woman's recollection of soup would not outweigh a signature in black ink on a page with a notary seal. But I never finished the sentence. Behind me in the second row, I heard the wooden bench creak. I heard the particular sound of someone standing up who had not planned to stand, the sharp intake of breath, the rustle of a coat, the moment of silence before a decision becomes irreversible. "I do," Sarah said. Her voice was clear and unshaking and aimed directly at the bench. "I have proof, because I notarized the original." The courtroom didn't gasp. That only happens in movies. What happened was worse. A silence so total I could hear Carl's chair shift half an inch across the floor. He looked at Sarah. For the first time all morning, he looked at someone, and what I saw on his face wasn't anger or surprise. It was the expression of a man who had forgotten that the people he'd stolen from were related to each other. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper, and I sat on a bench outside courtroom 7 with my hands folded over a manila envelope that held what was left of my name. Diane had gone inside to file a last-minute motion. James sat 2 seats down from me, his elbows on his knees, turning his wedding ring the way he always did when he was deciding whether to say something careful or something honest. He chose silence, which at that point in our lives meant the same thing as love. I'd dressed deliberately that morning, navy blazer, pearl studs, low heels that didn't wobble. I wanted the judge to see a woman in possession of herself, not a trembling victim clutching tissues. I'd been that woman for long enough. The manila envelope held my bank statements, the original power of attorney I'd signed 4 years ago. Limited, specific, notarized at my own kitchen table with a neighbor as witness, and 3 months of records showing withdrawals I hadn't authorized, accounts I hadn't opened, and a life insurance policy naming Carl Meredith as sole beneficiary. Diane had organized everything with the ruthless tenderness of someone who believed paperwork could function as armor. I wanted to believe her. The courtroom was half empty. Carl sat at the opposite table in a charcoal suit I was fairly certain I'd paid for. His posture relaxed, his hands clasped like a man settling in for a business lunch. He didn't look at me. That was the cruelest part. Not his anger, not his contempt, but his total indifference, as if I were a line item he'd already reconciled. Diane presented our case first. She was precise and unhurried, walking the judge through the financial timeline with the patience of someone unspooling thread from a snarl. I watched the judge's face, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses she kept pushing up the bridge of her nose, and tried to read whether the numbers landed the way they should, whether the story added up the way I'd lived it. Then Carl's lawyer stood up, and the room shifted. He was younger than I'd expected, narrow-shouldered, with the kind of bland confidence that comes from never having been truly doubted. He acknowledged everything Diane had presented. He didn't dispute the withdrawals or the accounts. What he did, with the calm of a man laying down a winning card, was produce a second power of attorney, one I didn't remember signing, that granted Carl full discretionary control over my finances, my property, and my medical decisions. Unrestricted, irrevocable, and it bore my genuine signature, not a forgery, not a photocopy, but my own handwriting in blue ink, the slight leftward lean I'd carried since childhood, undeniable as a fingerprint. The air went out of me, not all at once, but slowly, like a tire on a gravel road. And then I remembered my 71st birthday. Carl had organized a dinner at that Italian place on Elm, with the brick walls and the candles jammed into wine bottles. Sarah had been there. James had not. He'd been recovering from a knee surgery and sent flowers instead. Carl brought champagne and a cake from the bakery I liked, and somewhere between the second glass and the singing, he'd slid a small stack of papers across the tablecloth and told me it was just an update, something his lawyer recommended. Routine housekeeping. I'd signed between the cake and the champagne. I'd signed because the room was warm and my daughter was smiling, and I trusted the moment more than I trusted the document. Diane objected. She argued undue influence, diminished capacity at the time of signing, procedural failures in notarization. The judge listened without expression. I sat still and held the manila envelope and felt every year of my age settle into my spine like sandbags. The judge set a continuance for 6 weeks. Carl's lawyer packed his briefcase slowly, the way people do when they want you to watch them win. Then he paused beside my bench and leaned down, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something sharp and botanical that didn't belong in a building this old. He spoke the way men speak when they want to be remembered for their restraint, rather than their cruelty. "You should know," he said, "that your daughter's name appears as co-signatory on every account Mr. Meredith opened. Every single one. I mention it only because it may affect how you choose to proceed." He straightened his tie and walked away, and I watched him go the way you watch a surgeon leave the room before the anesthesia wears off. You know the cut has been made, you just haven't felt it yet. Diane was beside me a moment later, her hand on my arm, her voice already working through next steps and motions and strategy, but I couldn't hear any of it. The hallway had gone thick and muffled, as though someone had wrapped the courthouse in gauze. People moved past us. A clerk dropped a stack of folders, and the sound reached me from very far away, the way thunder sounds when it belongs to a storm in another county. Co-signatory, every account. I turned the word over and over like a stone in my mouth. I thought about Sarah's face at that birthday dinner, the way she'd smiled when Carl slid the papers across the tablecloth. I had read that smile as love, as my daughter being glad I was surrounded by people who cared for me. But a smile can be a lock too. A smile can be the hand that holds the door shut while someone else empties the room. I didn't want it to be true. I sat on that bench and I bargained with the fluorescent light and the scuffed linoleum and the faint sound of someone's heels clicking down the corridor. And I offered up every alternative explanation I could build. Maybe she hadn't known what she was signing either. Maybe Carl had fooled her the same way he'd fooled me. Maybe the papers were forged. Maybe the lawyer was lying. Maybe there was a version of this where my daughter was still the girl who brought me marigolds from the garden when she was 7. Dirt still clinging to the roots because she hadn't wanted to waste a single second washing them before she put them in my hands. But I was 68 years old, and I had spent the last year learning the difference between what I wanted to be true and what the documents said. The documents didn't care about marigolds. Diane sat down beside me. She opened her mouth to speak, and I held up one hand and she went quiet. I appreciated that about her. She understood that some silences aren't empty. Some silences are a person rebuilding the architecture of their entire life because a wall they thought was load-bearing turned out to be made of paper. "Did you know?" I asked her. "Not about the law, not about the case, about Sarah." Diane looked at me with those steady, careful eyes, and she said she had suspected, but that suspecting wasn't enough to bring to a woman who was already carrying more than anyone should. I nodded. I folded my hands back over the manila envelope. The courthouse hummed around me, indifferent and enormous, full of other people's disasters. I had spent a year believing I'd been robbed by a stranger who'd wormed his way into my life. But Carl hadn't wormed his way in. He'd been invited, and the person who held the door open, who signed her name beside his on every account, who smiled at me over birthday cake, while my future was carved up and distributed, that person had my maiden name and my mother's jawline, and a set of house keys I had given her myself. Sarah hadn't failed to protect me. She had been in on it from the beginning. The forensic accountant's preliminary report arrived on a Tuesday, and the first page alone contained my son-in-law's signature 47 times, each one forged from mine. I sat at my kitchen table with the document spread before me like an autopsy, and I suppose that's what it was, an autopsy of 15 years of trust, laid open under fluorescent light with all its organs labeled and weighed. Diane had warned me on the phone that morning. She'd said, "Eleanor, you might want someone with you when you read this." I'd told her I was 68 years old and had buried a husband and survived a stroke, and I could read a piece of paper by myself. That was pride talking. Pride has always been the last part of me to learn anything. The report was methodical. Carl Meredith had been draining my accounts in increments designed to stay beneath the reporting thresholds. 9,000 here, 4,800 there. The financial equivalent of a man stealing a house one brick at a time. He'd created mirror statements, the kind that looked enough like the real ones that an old woman glancing at her mail wouldn't notice the numbers shrinking. I hadn't noticed. I need to say that plainly because it's true, and because the shame of it still tastes like copper on the back of my tongue. I hadn't noticed because I'd trusted him the way you trust the floor to hold you up in the morning. But it was the second section of the report that changed the architecture of my grief entirely. Diane's forensic team had traced the withdrawals to their terminus. The money hadn't simply vanished into Carl's personal accounts, which is what I'd assumed, what everyone had assumed. Instead, it flowed through a shell company registered in Delaware, a company called Linden Grove Holdings, incorporated 3 years earlier, operating out of a P.O. box in a strip mall I'd never heard of. Carl was listed as managing partner. That part made sense. That part fit the shape of the betrayal I'd already been learning to carry. It was the cosigner that broke the shape entirely. I read the name twice, then I took off my reading glasses, cleaned them on the hem of my blouse the way I always do when I'm stalling, and I read it a third time. The letters didn't rearrange themselves. They never do, no matter how badly you need them to. Sarah Hartfield Cruz, my daughter, my only living child, the girl I'd driven to ballet every Saturday for 9 years, the woman who'd held my hand in the hospital after James died and told me we'd figure out the finances together, that I shouldn't worry, that she'd find me someone trustworthy to manage things. She'd found me Carl. I set the paper down and pressed both palms flat against the table because the kitchen had started to tilt in a way that had nothing to do with my blood pressure. I thought about calling Diane, I thought about calling James, and then I remembered again that James was dead, which is a particular kind of cruelty that grief reserves for its worst moments, making you reach for the person who would know how to absorb this, only to find the empty chair. 3 years. Linden Grove Holdings had existed for 3 years, which meant Sarah had been standing in my living room on Thanksgiving, spooning cranberry sauce onto my plate, asking about my hip, kissing my cheek at the door, all while a company with her name on it swallowed my savings like a slow drain. I tried to find the version of this that wasn't what it looked like. Maybe Carl had forged her name too. Maybe she'd signed something without reading it. I was already building the scaffolding of excuses, because that's what mothers do. We construct architecture around the unthinkable so we don't have to live inside it. But the forensic team had included a photocopy of the original incorporation document, and I pulled it from the stack with fingers that had gone numb at the tips. I held it up to the light coming through the window above the sink, and there it was, every letter pressed into the page with the familiar lean she'd never outgrown. The way the capital S in Sarah curled like a fishhook at the top. The way the H in Hartfield stood too tall, as if it were stretching to see over the other letters, and those T's, crossed with a sweeping horizontal line that drifted slightly upward at the end, the same flourish I'd corrected and corrected until one afternoon she'd looked up at me with her milk teeth and said, "But Mama, I like it better when it flies." I'd let her keep it. I'd told her it gave her penmanship personality. Now it gave her away. I set the document on the kitchen counter and pressed both palms flat against it, the way you'd press a wound to stop the bleeding. The house was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed its one low note. A cardinal landed on the feeder outside and tilted its head at me through the glass, and I remember thinking how ordinary the world insisted on being while mine was reconfiguring itself into something I did not recognize. 47 forged signatures on the financial transfers. Those belonged to Carl, or to whoever he'd hired to mimic my hand. The forensic team had been clear about that. But this document, the one that created the shell company, the vessel that had carried my money out of my accounts and into a place I was never meant to find, this one Sarah had signed herself, willingly, in her own hand, on a date I cross-referenced later with my kitchen calendar, where I'd written in blue ink, *Sarah here for lunch, made the good soup. She'd eaten my potato leek soup and then driven to a notary. I lowered myself into the chair by the window and sat with that knowledge the way you sit with a fever, not fighting it, just letting it move through you, waiting to see what it would leave behind. I thought about calling James, who by then had become the only person I trusted with the full ugliness of this. But I didn't reach for the phone. Some things you have to hold alone first. Let them take their full shape in your hands before you show them to anyone. Because once you speak a thing like this out loud, it becomes permanent. It becomes the story. And I wasn't ready for that yet. I kept thinking about the morning Sarah was born, how they'd placed her on my chest, and she'd opened one eye, just one, like she was already deciding whether the world was worth the trouble. I'd laughed and told the nurse she was going to be a skeptic. I'd been so proud of that. My daughter, already discerning at 4 minutes old. It hadn't occurred to me in that bright delivery room that discernment could curdle, that the same sharp mind I'd celebrated could one day be turned on me with precision, with patience, with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly where I kept my trust and how thin the lock was. Carl Meredith had been the instrument. I understood that now with a clarity that felt almost surgical. He'd provided the mechanism, the financial architecture, the professional veneer, but Sarah had provided something he never could have manufactured on his own. She'd provided access, not to my accounts, to my belief that I was loved without conditions. I sat in that kitchen for 2 hours. The cardinal left and came back and left again. The light shifted from the window above the sink to the window beside the door, traveling its familiar arc across the floor, and I watched it move the way I'd watched it move for 30 years in that house, and everything was the same and nothing was. When I finally stood, I folded the document along its original creases, slid it back into the envelope, and wrote the date on the outside in my own handwriting. Steady, because I refused to let my hand shake for this. Then I picked up the phone and called my attorney, not my son, because a mother's grief is one thing, but a mother's evidence is another. Sarah had crossed her T's the way I taught her. The kitchen light had burned out 3 days earlier, and I hadn't replaced it. I'd been sitting in that darkness on purpose, letting it match what had settled behind my ribs. I'd stopped eating at the table by then. Meals happened standing at the counter, if they happened at all. A sleeve of crackers, a glass of water I'd forget halfway through. The refrigerator hummed its low, indifferent hymn, and I let it be the only voice in the house. 68 years old, and I had learned something new about silence. It wasn't empty. It was architectural. It held the shape of every conversation I couldn't bring myself to replay. Diane had warned me, not in so many words, she was too careful a woman for that, but in the way she'd pause before answering my questions about the forensic audit, the way her pen would hover over certain pages like a divining rod that had found something it didn't want to name. I'd noticed. I'd filed it away in that drawer where I kept things I wasn't ready to open. We all have that drawer. Mine was getting full. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Certified mail, return address from the document examiner Diane had hired independently, outside the firm, outside anyone's reach. I remember the weight of it, heavier than paper should be, or maybe that was just my hands refusing to cooperate. I carried it to the dark kitchen the way you'd carry a bird with a broken wing, gently, knowing gentleness wouldn't save it. I didn't open it right away. I sat with it on my lap for what must have been an hour, running my finger along the sealed flap, listening to the house tick and settle around me. The oak floors James had helped me refinish the summer after his father died. The window frame Sarah had painted that awful coral color as a teenager, laughing while I pretended to be furious. Every surface in that house held a fingerprint from someone I loved, and I sat there among all those invisible marks like a woman in a museum after closing, surrounded by things she could no longer touch. When I finally tore the envelope, the report slid out clean. 12 pages, dense with technical language, stroke analysis, pen pressure mapping, baseline comparisons. Diane had included a note on yellow legal paper, just 3 words in her steady hand. "I'm so sorry. That should have told me everything. That should have stopped me cold." But I was 68, and I had already lost my savings, my sense of safety, my belief that the world operated on some rough approximation of fairness. What was one more loss? I kept reading. Carl Meredith's signature appeared where I expected it. Sprawled across the authorization forms, the transfer documents, the fabricated power of attorney. I'd stared at that handwriting so many times it had lost all meaning, the way a word does when you repeat it until it dissolves. But next to each of Carl's signatures sat another, a co-signer, someone who had verified, authorized, enabled every withdrawal, every redirect, every careful amputation of my financial life. The examiner had isolated this second hand with surgical precision, the slant, the spacing, the distinctive way certain letters curled back on themselves like they were trying to retract what they'd written. I knew that curl. I'd seen it on birthday cards, on the back of photographs, on the mortgage paperwork when James co-signed my refinance after the roof caved in during the ice storm of 2019. I'd seen it in crayon, in pencil, in the shaky ballpoint of a 7-year-old writing his name for the first time on a school form I still kept in a shoebox in my closet. My chest didn't tighten. It opened, grotesquely, like a door blown off its hinges, swinging into a room I'd refused to know was there. I thought of every midnight phone call, his voice heavy with what I'd mistaken for concern. I thought of him in Diane's conference room, jaw set, eyes wet, squeezing my hands so tightly I'd felt the bones shift. I thought of the way he'd said, "We'll find who did this, Mum asterisk." The emphasis on asterisk, find asterisk, as though the person were lost somewhere out in the world, some stranger with clever hands and no conscience, and not sitting right beside me, breathing the same stale conference room air, wearing the same aftershave his father used to wear. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, because people expect the crying. They expect the collapse, the dramatic crumple to the kitchen floor. But what happened was stranger and uglier. I went very still, the way an animal goes still when the trap has already closed and thrashing will only tighten the teeth. I sat in that dark kitchen with the forensic report flat on the table in front of me, and I listened to the refrigerator hum its one stupid note, and I breathed, and I let the knowing fill every corner of the room I'd been refusing to enter. 3 days I'd been sitting in that darkness on purpose. Now I understood why. Some part of me, the part that had raised him, that had memorized the weight of his infant skull in the crook of my elbow, that had driven him to hockey practice in blizzards and argued with his third-grade teacher about a reading score that didn't capture what he was. Some part of me had already done the math. The timeline. Carl showing up 6 weeks after James's visit, knowing exactly which accounts to target, which ones had the weakest verification, which ones I never checked because James had always told me, "Don't worry about those, Mum. I keep an eye on them for you asterisk." He'd kept an eye on them all right. He'd kept both eyes on them. He'd drawn Carl a map. I picked up my phone and scrolled to his name. His contact photo was from Sarah's wedding. James in a navy suit, laughing at something off camera, his arm slung around my shoulder. I looked at that photo for a long time. I studied the laugh, the way his head tilted back, the easy confidence of a man who believed he would never be caught because the person he'd stolen from loved him too much to look. He wasn't wrong. For 68 years, love had been the architecture of every decision I'd ever made. I'd built my whole life on it, load-bearing walls of trust, foundations poured in faith that the people I'd carried would at least have the decency not to set the house on fire from the inside. And here was the match. Here was the accelerant. Here was the careful, patient arson of a son who knew exactly how long it would take his mother to smell the smoke. I set the forensic report on the table, pressed my thumb against the signature until the ink nearly smudged, and read my son James's middle name, the one he only ever used on legal documents, looped into every single page. The man I'd called crying at midnight, the one who'd held my hand in the lawyer's office and sworn we'd find who did this. He had already known, because he'd helped. I closed the report. I folded my hands on top of it the way I used to fold them in church, fingers laced, knuckles white, a posture that looked like prayer but was really just a woman holding herself together at the seams. The kitchen stayed dark, the refrigerator kept humming, and somewhere across town, my son was sleeping in a house my money had paid for, dreaming whatever dreams the guilty dream when they believe they've gotten away with it. I picked up the phone again, but I didn't call James. I called Diane. The courtroom smelled like furniture polish and dread, and Carl Meredith walked in wearing the same tie he'd worn to my husband's funeral. I recognized the pattern before I recognized the man. Navy silk with those thin gold diagonals, the kind of tie James would have called trying too hard for a Tuesday. Carl had stood beside me at the graveside in that tie, his hand on my shoulder, telling me not to worry about the accounts, that James had left everything in perfect order. I'd thanked him. I'd actually thanked him, and the memory of that sat in my chest like a swallowed stone as the bailiff called the room to order. The gallery was sparse, a few reporters. Diane 2 rows behind me, her posture as straight and deliberate as a fence post, the way she always held herself when she was furious and determined not to show it. Sarah sat beside her, my daughter's hands clasped in her lap, so tightly her knuckles had gone the color of old bone. I didn't turn around to look at them. I could feel them there the way you feel weather approaching. A pressure change, a charge in the air. Carl's attorney was a woman named Pruitt, compact and precise, with a voice like a letter opener slicing through an envelope. She moved through the preliminaries with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and believed, genuinely believed, she was going to win. I watched her arrange her documents. I watched Carl sit with his hands folded, his expression arranged into something meant to resemble concern. He'd always been good at arranging things. That was, after all, why we were here. Then Pruitt introduced the letter. She held it up in its clear plastic sleeve like a communion wafer, something sacred and unchallengeable, and read it aloud. James's handwriting, James's signature. A letter dated November of 2020, authorizing Carl to manage and redistribute funds from 3 accounts, including the trust, including the annuity that was supposed to carry me through whatever years I had left. The language was dense, formal, the kind of thing James would never have written without a lawyer present. But the handwriting, God help me, the handwriting looked right. It looked like the hand that had written me 43 years of grocery lists and love notes and reminders to call the plumber. The judge studied the document, then she looked at me over the rims of her glasses, and in that single glance I felt every molecule of credibility I possessed begin to evaporate. It was the look you give someone who might be confused, who might be grief-addled, who might have constructed an elaborate accusation because she couldn't accept that her dead husband had made decisions she didn't understand. My throat closed. I had spent 14 months rebuilding myself into someone who could sit in this chair, and one piece of paper was dismantling me in real time. Then I heard the gallery bench creak. Sarah stood. My daughter stood the way she'd stood as a girl when a neighborhood kid accused her of lying. Not fast, not dramatic, just upward, with the full quiet architecture of her spine. She held a plastic sleeve of her own, and her voice when she spoke was steady enough to set a watch by. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a document for comparison. Pruitt objected. The judge hesitated, but Sarah was already walking forward, and what she placed on the clerk's desk was a birthday card. James had sent it to her in March of 2019. A card with a cartoon dog on the front and a handwritten message inside. Asterisk Mia, you make 68 years feel like a good deal. Love, Dad. 3 sentences. Ordinary. Sacred in the way only ordinary things become after someone dies. And there it was, visible even from where I sat. The capital L in love was identical to the capital L in letter, the slant of the S, the particular way James crossed his T's with a slight upward hook. Carl hadn't just forged the letter, he'd traced it. He'd laid a piece of paper over my husband's birthday card to our daughter and traced the letters like a child copying homework, then rearranged them into permission, into authorization, into a document that said James Hartfield had willingly handed over control of accounts he'd spent 40 years filling, one modest deposit at a time. Carl had taken the most intimate thing a dying man could leave, his handwriting, the actual pressure of his fingers on a pen, and turned it into a leash around my neck. The courtroom didn't gasp. That's something people get wrong about real moments. What happened was quieter and worse. The silence simply changed texture, became something with teeth. I watched the judge remove her glasses, hold them in one hand, and look at the birthday card. Then at the authorization letter, then at Carl. Not quickly. She took her time, and her patience was the most frightening thing in that room. Carl's attorney, Pruitt, with his rehearsed calm and his cufflinks that cost more than my grocery budget for a month, stood up and asked for a recess. His voice didn't crack, exactly, but it thinned. I'd heard that sound before, in the hospice, when the night nurse would page the doctor and say asterisk, I think you should come now. A professional running out of professional things to do. But Carl didn't stand. He didn't lean over to whisper strategy to Pruitt. He didn't shuffle papers or loosen his tie or do any of the small, restless things a man does when his story starts to collapse. He sat perfectly still with both hands flat on the defense table, fingers spread, and he stared at that birthday card the way you'd stare at a photograph of someone you used to be. Not with fear, not even with anger, with recognition. I knew that look. I'd seen it on James in the final weeks, when he'd gaze at our backyard through the hospice window and understand, all at once and without appeal, that he would never stand in that grass again. Carl was watching the last door close. He knew it. And he sat with the knowledge the way a man sits with a diagnosis, motionless, because movement would make it real. The judge granted the recess. 15 minutes. People rose. Someone coughed. The stenographer stretched her fingers. Normal sounds returned to fill the space that the silence had carved, and life pretended to be ordinary again the way it always does after something irreversible. Sarah came back to me. She didn't sit in the gallery this time. She sat right beside me on the bench, and she took my hand, and her palm was damp and steady and warm. She didn't say asterisk, we got him asterisk, or it's almost over asterisk, or any of the things you'd expect. She said, "That card was on my refrigerator for 3 years, Mum. He must have seen it every time he came to pick up the casserole dishes." And there it was, the thing I hadn't let myself calculate until that moment, the timeline. Carl had visited Sarah's apartment. He'd eaten our food, accepted our kindness, sat at her kitchen table and offered condolences about her father's health, while his eyes traced the handwriting on a birthday card held to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. He'd been planning it. Not after James died, not in the fog of grief when opportunities presented themselves to weak men. Before, while James was still breathing, while I was still holding my husband's hand at night and telling him he'd be home by spring. I didn't feel triumph. I want to be clear about that. I sat in that courtroom during the recess with my daughter's hand in mine, and what I felt was not victory or vindication or any of the clean, sharp emotions people expect when the truth finally cuts through. What I felt was heavy. Old, tired in the specific way you get tired when you learn that someone you trusted had been measuring your life for a coffin while you were still living in it. Carl had started forging that letter while